February 14th, 2018, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The corridors are filled with Valentine's Day balloons and the restless energy of the final bell. Then, the deafening rhythmic crack of a legally purchased AR-15 shatters the afternoon. The most terrifying aspect of this massacre isn't just the sheer brutality, it's the immediate aftermath. The shooter doesn't take his own life. He doesn't engage in a final stand with police. Instead, he drops his rifle on a stairwell, blends into a terrified crowd of fleeing teenagers, and casually walks to a nearby McDonald's for a drink, leaving a war zone behind him. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Parkland, Florida is the kind of suburban enclave designed specifically to keep the world's ugliness at bay. Tucked away on the edge of the Everglades, it boasts meticulously manicured lawns, gated communities, and a median household income that dwarfs the national average. It is a place defined by its safety, an affluent bubble where parents relocate primarily to secure a spot for their children in the highly rated public school system. Violent crime here wasn't just rare, it was practically a foreign concept. Within this meticulously structured environment, the Cruz household was a stark anomaly. It was a pressure cooker of escalating dysfunction hidden behind a standard suburban facade. Born in the fall of 1998, the boy and his biological half-brother were adopted as infants by Roger and Linda Cruz. Initially, the family presented a picture of domestic normalcy, but the foundation cracked early. When the perpetrator was just 5 years old, Roger suffered a fatal heart attack. Linda was suddenly a single mother, left to manage 2 growing boys, one of whom was already displaying deeply concerning behavioral aberrations. The signs of profound psychological decay did not materialize overnight. They began in early childhood and metastasized year by year. Teachers and neighbors noted an unrelenting pattern of aggression. There were unprovoked attacks on other children, instances of biting, hitting, and an absolute inability to regulate basic emotions. Clinical evaluations yielded a dense file of diagnoses: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, developmental delays, and oppositional defiant disorder. Later assessments would point towards severe depression and traits associated with the autism spectrum. He was heavily medicated, cycling through various psychiatric prescriptions, yet the core volatility remained completely untouched. Linda struggled immensely. She cared for her adopted son, but was fundamentally unequipped to handle his explosive rages. As he grew physically larger, the power dynamic in the home shifted dangerously. The teenager began to terrorize his mother. The interior of their home reflected this chaos, with holes punched through the drywall and shattered belongings littering the floors. Law enforcement became a permanent fixture at their residence. Over a span of roughly a decade, deputies responded to the house dozens of times for domestic disturbances, varying from throwing heavy objects to outright physical assaults on Linda. Beyond the domestic violence, a much darker pathology was taking root, a relentless fascination with inflicting pain. Neighborhood reports detailed incidents of extreme animal cruelty. He used a pellet gun to shoot at local wildlife, attempted to drown animals in the family pool, and openly expressed a desire to kill. These weren't the simple missteps of a troubled youth. They were the clinical red flags of an emerging sociopath. Yet each incident was treated in isolation by the authorities. The school system, mental health professionals, and local deputies repeatedly encountered a highly disturbed individual, but the overarching threat was never fully synthesized. To manage his disruptive presence, the district frequently transferred him between alternative behavioral centers and mainstream classrooms. It was a bureaucratic shuffle that prioritized temporary containment over long-term intervention. He was a known entity to everyone: school resource officers, counselors, and local police. He was the student who brought knives to campus hidden in his lunchbox, the one who openly researched combat gear on school computers, the one who made classmates so deeply uncomfortable they frequently remarked to one another that he would be the one to eventually shoot up the school. The environment surrounding him was saturated with blaring warnings. His psychological profile wasn't a closely guarded secret uncovered by detectives after the fact. It was broadcast openly to an entire community. The tragedy of his development was not a sudden psychological break. It was a slow, agonizingly visible descent into extreme violence, happening in plain sight under the warm Florida sun. By the time the teenager enrolled at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, the friction between his deeply disturbed psyche and the structured academic environment was absolute. The campus, sprawling and populated by over 3,000 students, offered endless targets for his unfocused aggression. Inside the classrooms, his presence was a constant source of profound unease. Fellow students reported him selling knives out of a lunchbox. He brought spent bullet casings to school, openly displaying them to peers in the hallways. His homework assignments were frequently defaced with racial slurs and hateful extremist iconography. Administrators responded with a revolving door of disciplinary actions. Suspensions piled up. He was strictly banned from bringing a backpack to campus, forced to carry his belongings in clear plastic bags. The system attempted to manage the threat by repeatedly shuffling him to an off-site behavioral center, only to reintegrate him back into the main student body when his term ended. This administrative cycle continued until early 2017, when a physical altercation over an ex-girlfriend finally triggered his formal expulsion from the district. But expelling a threat does not neutralize it. It merely removes it from the administration's immediate line of sight. Removed from the daily constraints of school, the 19-year-old retreated entirely into a dark digital echo chamber. His online footprint evolved into a glaring neon sign of impending mass violence. He created social media profiles dedicated exclusively to his arsenal. Pictures surfaced showing him holding various blades, brandishing firearms, and displaying mutilated animals. The rhetoric accompanying these images was steeped in violent racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. The digital bleeding soon crossed into real-world warnings. A bail bondsman in Mississippi flagged a YouTube comment posted from an account bearing the teenager's exact name. The message stated a clear, unambiguous goal: to become a professional school shooter. The FBI was notified. Agents conducted a preliminary assessment, but the tip was ultimately closed and filed away in a database due to an alleged inability to positively identify the author. Later, another caller contacted a designated FBI tip line, explicitly warning that the boy possessed an arsenal, exhibited severe psychological distress, and was actively planning to attack a school. Protocol dictated the information be routed directly to the Miami field office. It never was. This systemic blindness extended to local law enforcement. Despite deputies responding to the family home on numerous occasions, intervening in violent domestic disputes, and documenting threats of self-harm, the teenager was never involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation under the state's Baker Act. That single bureaucratic omission proved fatal. Without a documented psychiatric hold or a felony conviction, his legal background check remained perfectly clean. On February 11th, 2017, just a few weeks after turning 18, he walked into a local tactical supply store in Coral Springs. He presented a valid identification card, filled out the required federal forms, and passed the instant background check without a single red flag. He legally purchased a Smith & Wesson E.P. and P-15 semi-automatic rifle. The transaction was entirely seamless. Over the subsequent months, he legally accumulated a small arsenal, a shotgun, additional rifles, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He also acquired a tactical vest, an accessory designed strictly to carry heavy loads of magazines, ensuring he could sustain a high rate of fire without pausing. The tools of mass casualty were obtained with terrifying bureaucratic ease. Then, the final tether to society snapped. In November 2017, Linda Cruz succumbed to complications from pneumonia. The mother who had frantically tried to manage his volatile existence for nearly 2 decades was gone. The teenager was effectively orphaned. He briefly relocated to a mobile home park with a family friend, before being taken in by the Sneed family, whose son he knew from school. The Sneeds offered him a spare room, believing they were helping a grieving young man find his footing. They helped him secure a low-wage job at a local discount store. To them, he appeared quiet, perhaps a bit odd, but compliant. They established strict house rules, primarily regarding his weapons. He was required to keep his firearms securely locked inside a metal gun safe in his bedroom. He readily agreed to the terms. but the illusion of safety was paper thin. He retained the only key to the lockbox. Under their roof, while going to his mundane retail job by day, he was finalizing a massacre by night. In the weeks leading up to mid-February, his isolation crystallized into absolute, calculated intent. He began using his cell phone to record video manifestos, speaking directly to the camera in the quiet confines of his bedroom. He introduced himself, outlined his exact plan to return to his former high school, and estimated his projected body count. There was no visible rage in his demeanor, only a hollow, detached anticipation. He bragged about the notoriety he would inevitably achieve. He meticulously detailed the logistics, the ride-share drop-off, the tactical approach to the freshman building, the element of surprise. The recordings captured a mind completely untethered from human empathy, treating the impending slaughter as a grand theatrical debut. The storm had fully gathered. All that remained was execution. The afternoon of February 14th begins with mundane precision. At 2:06 p.m., a hired driver pulls up to the Sneed residence. The passenger waiting on the curb carries a heavy, dark duffel bag and a backpack. He climbs into the vehicle. During the short ride, he remains entirely silent, staring out the window. The driver later noted to authorities that her passenger simply looked like an ordinary teenager struggling with an oversized music case or sports gear. There is no tension in his posture, no nervous twitching, just cold, vacant anticipation. At 2:19 p.m., the car approaches the sprawling campus of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. The drop-off point is just steps from the gates. He exits the vehicle and walks with deliberate, measured steps toward Building 12. Building 12 is a massive 3-story cinder block structure primarily housing freshmen. It is designed with long, straight corridors and enclosed stairwells at either end, a fatal architectural funnel. As he crosses the perimeter, the first catastrophic layer of security failure occurs. An unarmed campus monitor spots him approaching. The monitor instantly recognizes the young man. He knows this is the expelled student who had explicitly threatened the school, the one staff had been formally warned about. The monitor radios a colleague to report the sighting, but he does not utter the 2 words that would instantly lock down the entire campus. Code red. The hesitation allows the perpetrator to pull open the heavy doors of the east stairwell uncontested. He slips inside the concrete enclosure. He unzips the dark duffel bag, extracts the Smith & Wesson M and P15. He methodically loads the weapon and slips the heavy tactical vest over his shoulders. His pockets and pouches are weighed down with extra magazines. The preparation is entirely unhurried. A freshman student pushes open the stairwell door, stumbling directly into the preparations. The perpetrator glances up, his face completely devoid of emotion. He advises the boy to leave immediately, stating that things are about to get bad. The terrified student turns and sprints down the hall, desperate to find a teacher. But time has run out. It is exactly 2:21 p.m. The heavy stairwell door swings open onto the first-floor corridor. The pacing shifts. He raises the rifle. The first shots tear through the air. The sound is absolute and apocalyptic. In the enclosed cinder block hallway, the concussive blasts of the AR-15 echo with brain-rattling intensity. He does not kick down doors. He does not engage in close quarters room clearing. The classroom doors are locked, but each features a narrow pane of glass. It is a fatal design flaw. He simply walks down the center of the corridor, turning his weapon toward the windows of rooms 1215, 1216, 1214, and 1213. He fires continuously. The high-velocity rounds shatter the glass, shred the metal frames, and punch effortlessly through the thick drywall. Inside the classrooms, the reality is pure horror. Students scramble under desks, pressing themselves against the cold linoleum, trying to shrink into the floorboards. The corridor fills with an impenetrable, choking fog of white drywall dust and gray gun smoke. The sharp, metallic scent of copper and burning cordite saturates the air. The heavy accumulation of particles reaches the sensors on the ceiling. The sirens trigger. The strobe lights begin to flash violently through the dust. The piercing, rhythmic blare of the fire alarm creates a catastrophic secondary crisis. Decades of ingrained school conditioning take over. Students and teachers on the second and third floors, unable to clearly distinguish the muffled gunfire from the deafening alarm, assume there is a fire. They follow protocol. They unlock their doors. They step out of their secure classrooms and begin to flood into the exposed hallways. They are walking directly into a kill zone. Down below, the shooter circles back. He retraces his steps, firing a second time into the classrooms to target anyone who has shifted from their initial hiding spot. His gait is terrifyingly casual. He walks, pauses, aims, and fires. At 2:24 p.m., he pushes through the heavy doors into the west stairwell and begins his ascent. He reaches the second floor. The corridor is mostly empty. A quick-thinking staff member here had recognized the distinct rhythmic popping of semi-automatic gunfire over the wail of the fire alarm. They managed to enforce a rapid lockdown just seconds before the perpetrator emerged. He fires into room 1234. The rounds shatter the window, but the students are huddled deep in the hard corners of the room, completely out of his line of sight. He assesses the empty hallway. He does not linger. He turns back to the stairwell and climbs higher. At 2:25 p.m., he steps onto the third floor. The scene is absolute, unfiltered chaos. The fire alarm had fully mobilized this level. The long, narrow corridor is packed with confused teenagers and faculty. As the shooter emerges from the stairwell, the crowd realizes the horrifying truth. Panic erupts. The hallway offers zero physical cover. It is a straight, concrete tunnel. Teachers scream for the kids to turn back. They shove students back toward the classrooms. But the doors, which lock automatically from the outside, have clicked shut behind them. Faculty members fumble with lanyards and keys with shaking hands, desperate to swing open the heavy wooden barriers as the shooter raises his rifle. He fires straight down the corridor. The staccato blasts are relentless. Students drop to the floor. Teachers physically throw themselves over the teenagers, using their own bodies to absorb the high-velocity rounds. The sheer kinetic energy of the 5.56 ammunition means a single bullet effortlessly tears through multiple targets. Behind locked doors, terrified students huddle in the dark. Dispatchers at the county emergency center are completely overwhelmed. Operators struggle to decipher the whispered, frantic pleas of teenagers begging for police, reporting that the shooter is standing right outside their door. The 911 lines are a cacophony of sobbing, blaring alarms and the distant, rhythmic crack of the rifle. The perpetrator advances past the carnage. He reaches the teacher's lounge at the far end of the hall. He spots the large exterior windows overlooking the central campus courtyard below. His behavior shifts. He attempts to adapt his strategy. He raises the rifle and fires directly at the window, intending to shatter it and establish a sniper position to rain fire down on the fleeing masses outside the building. The glass cracks, spiderwebbing violently, but it does not break. It is hurricane impact glass. Reinforced with heavy polymer webbing, it absorbs the rounds and holds firm. He fires again. The window bows, but refuses to shatter. His sniper nest is compromised. He turns back toward the main hallway. He moves to insert a fresh magazine. The weapon jams. The feeding mechanism seizes. He forcefully racks the bolt, trying to clear the chamber. The rifle remains locked. He stands in the smoky, flashing hallway and stares at the jammed weapon. The mechanical failure breaks his rhythm. The adrenaline of the assault seems to instantly evaporate. The theatricality of his plan dissolves into a sudden, cowardly realization of his own vulnerability. It is exactly 2:27 p.m. The entire massacre has lasted just under 6 minutes. He makes a rapid, calculated pivot. He ejects the jammed magazine. He unbuckles the heavy tactical vest and lets it fall to the blood-slicked linoleum. He drops the AR-15 on the landing of the stairwell. In a matter of seconds, he completely sheds the identity of an active shooter. He morphs back into an anonymous, unassuming teenager. He pushes through the stairwell doors and exits the building. He merges into the frantic, surging tide of students sprinting across the campus lawns. He keeps his head down, matching their terrified pace, blending flawlessly into the agonizing chaos he alone created. The aftermath inside Building 12 is a sensory nightmare. The first arriving deputies breach the heavy doors and step into an apocalyptic landscape. Fire alarms continue their relentless, piercing shriek, making vocal communication nearly impossible. The air is thick with a choking suspension of pulverized drywall, the harsh chemical odor of burning cordite, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Overhead, sprinklers have engaged in some areas, mixing water with the gray dust to create a slick, hazardous paste on the linoleum. Hundreds of brass 5.56 casings crunch under the boots of tactical officers as they sweep the first-floor corridor. The sheer scale of the devastation is instantly apparent, but the absolute priority is neutralizing the active threat. A command post is hastily established outside to monitor the campus closed-circuit television system. A school employee, frantic and staring at a bank of monitors, begins relaying the suspect's movements to the officers over the radio. He reports the shooter ascending the west stairwell, moving down the second-floor hallway, raising his weapon. Tactical teams pivot immediately. They stack up against the heavy fire doors, weapons drawn, hearts hammering against their ribs. They breach the second floor, sweeping the angles, expecting a heavy firefight. They find nothing. The employee continues to call out coordinates. He reports the suspect is now on the third floor, moving toward the teacher's lounge. Heavily armed units sprint up the concrete steps, adrenaline flooding their systems, prepared to engage the targets. They burst onto the third-floor landing. Again, the corridor is empty. They are chasing a phantom. It takes an agonizing 20 minutes to realize the fatal miscommunication. The school's camera system was not feeding a live broadcast to the command post. The employee was scrubbing through recorded footage to locate the perpetrator, narrating his actions to police dispatch without explicitly stating the timeline. The SWAT teams had been hunting an echo. They were tracking a massacre that was already over, trapped in a digital dead end, while the real threat evaporated into the humid Florida afternoon. Outside the perimeter, the scene is a chaotic stampede. Thousands of teenagers sprint across the sprawling athletic fields and adjacent roads, scaling chain-link fences to escape the campus. The perpetrator is right in the middle of them. He jogs alongside the terrified masses, his head down, his breathing perfectly steady. He is wearing a maroon polo shirt, the official JROTC uniform of the very school he just decimated. It acts as the ultimate urban camouflage. In the eyes of the panicked crowd and the arriving first responders, he is just another traumatized student fleeing for his life. He slips right through the tightening police cordon. Cruisers fly past him at high speeds, their sirens wailing, rushing toward the epicenter of the crisis. He ignores them entirely. He leaves the campus boundaries behind and begins a 2.5-mile walk through the affluent, palm-lined streets of Parkland. The contrast is staggering. Back at the high school, paramedics are establishing triage zones on the grass, treating devastating combat-style trauma wounds. Here, on the quiet suburban sidewalks, the architect of the carnage simply puts one foot in front of the other under the baking sun. At 2:50 p.m., the sliding glass doors of a local Walmart supercenter part, and he walks inside. The sudden blast of cold air conditioning is a stark shift from the heavy outdoor heat. He bypasses the merchandise aisles and heads directly to a Subway counter located near the cash registers. He orders a cherry ice drink. He calmly reaches into his pocket, hands over the cash, and takes a sip. He strolls out of the store, the sugary beverage in hand. The sheer, chilling banality of the act defies all logic. He continues his pedestrian route, arriving at a nearby McDonald's a few minutes later. He walks in, completely unnoticed, and slides into a hard plastic booth. He spots another teenager sitting nearby, a student who had just evacuated the high school and sought refuge in the restaurant. The perpetrator leans over and casually asks the boy for a ride. The student, unaware of the true identity of the person sitting across from him but deeply unsettled by his cold, hollow demeanor, refuses the request and quickly leaves the building. Rejected, the killer sits alone in the booth for a few more moments before standing up and wandering back out into a quiet residential neighborhood. By 3:30 p.m., the horrifying realization that the shooter is off campus has finally circulated through the unified command center. The delayed camera footage is discarded. A massive, multi-agency manhunt expands outward, shifting from a building clearing operation to a citywide grid search. Helicopters chop the air, casting sweeping shadows over the subdivisions. Dispatchers broadcast the physical description based on newly obtained eyewitness accounts. A young white male, maroon shirt, black pants, black baseball cap. 2 miles away, in the neighboring city of Coral Springs, Officer Michael Leonard is cruising down Wyndham Lakes Boulevard. The residential street is eerily quiet, shielded by tall hedges and manicured trees. At 3:41 p.m., Leonard spots a lone figure walking on the sidewalk. The clothing is a perfect match. The physical build is a perfect match. Leonard slows his cruiser and pulls abruptly to the curb. He draws his sidearm, leveling it through the open window, and issues a hard, uncompromising command for the individual to get on the ground. There is no final shootout. There is no desperate foot chase or ideological last stand. The teenager simply stops, looks at the officer, and lowers himself to the grass. He complies with every order. As handcuffs are ratcheted tightly around his wrists, he offers no resistance, no manifesto, no explanation. He simply complains to the arresting officer that his stomach hurts. The intense county-wide manhunt concludes not in a blaze of gunfire, but with a quiet, pathetic surrender on a pristine suburban lawn. Inside the Broward Sheriff's Office, the interrogation room is stark, brightly lit, and freezing. The teenager sits hunched over a metal table, stripped of his maroon polo shirt and dressed in light hospital scrubs. Detective John Kershaw takes the lead, initiating a psychological chess match that will last for hours. The suspect's demeanor oscillates between pathetic whimpering and a chilling blank detachment. He immediately attempts to establish a defense mechanism, claiming he was guided by a dark voice, a demon that took residence in his head and commanded him to burn, kill, and destroy. Kershaw listens, but he does not entertain the performance. Through methodical, indirect questioning, the investigator systematically deconstructs the insanity narrative right there in the room. He forces the suspect to confront the absolute, cold-blooded premeditation of his actions. The detective points out the undeniable logistics. A demon did not order a rideshare to the exact location. A demon did not consciously pack a heavy tactical vest with multiple magazines. A demon did not aim through the narrow glass panels of specific classroom doors to maximize the body count. When asked directly why he purchased the AR-15 in the first place, the suspect drops the supernatural facade and simply states that it looked cool. When the detective steps out of the room, hidden cameras capture the suspect's behavior. Believing he is alone, he begins a crude, theatrical display of mental illness, scratching at his own arms, punching himself in the face, and muttering toward the ceiling. He later begs the detective to kill him, expressing a sudden desire to die. Yet the investigator notes the glaring paradox. Just hours earlier, when the teenager held a loaded weapon and had the opportunity to end his own life, he chose instead to carefully abandon his rifle, discard his tactical gear, and blend in with the fleeing crowd to ensure his own survival. The profile that solidifies in the interrogation room is not one of a boy legally blind to reality, but of a calculating, deeply resentful individual who fully comprehended the magnitude of his violence. Meanwhile, the perimeter of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School is locked down under the glare of heavy floodlights. Building 12 has been transformed from an educational facility into a grim, multi-story time capsule. Forensic technicians begin the agonizing process of mapping the ballistic devastation. Every spent .556 casing, every shattered pane of impact glass, every blood trail must be painstakingly documented. But the most devastating element for the seasoned crime scene investigators is not visual, it is auditory. In the desolate, darkened corridors, cell phones ring incessantly. They buzz from inside abandoned, dust-covered backpacks and chime from the pockets of those who did not survive. It is an unbroken, agonizing audio loop of desperate mothers and fathers reaching out into the void. The technicians must work methodically around these vibrating devices, forced to tune out the digital cries for help while they process the trajectories of the high-velocity rounds that tore through the cinder block. 2 miles away, the Marriott Hotel in Coral Springs has become a localized purgatory. Hundreds of frantic parents were directed to the hotel ballrooms to await reunification. Throughout the late afternoon, buses transport surviving students to the staging area, resulting in tearful, chaotic embraces in the parking lot. But as the hours bleed into the deep night, the crowd of waiting parents slowly thins out, until only a small, terrified fraction remains. Authorities begin separating these last families, pulling them into private, partitioned rooms. The questions asked by the officials are clinical and horrifying. They request dental records. They inquire about distinct birthmarks, the exact brand of sneakers, or the color of the shirt their child put on that morning. A crushing reality drops over the remaining families. If a child had not texted by midnight, they were never coming home. The sudden wails of profound, shattered grief that echo through the hotel corridors mark the exact moment the community's soul is fractured beyond repair. By sunrise, the affluent bubble of Parkland is unrecognizable. The initial paralysis of grief instantly mutates into a highly volatile, unprecedented anger. This was a community that believed it had purchased immunity from the world's horrors through high property taxes and gated neighborhoods, only to realize the threat had been incubating in plain sight. The social echo reverberates violently as documented facts replace initial rumors. The public learns about the repeated, explicit FBI tips that were inexplicably archived without action. They read the logs detailing the dozens of times local deputies were dispatched to the suspect's home for violent behavior, resulting in zero legal constraints on his ability to purchase an arsenal. The most devastating revelation strikes when it is confirmed that an armed school resource officer took cover outside Building 12 during the entire duration of the massacre, failing to breach the doors and confront the shooter. The citizens of Parkland realized this tragedy was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was a catastrophic, multi-agency collapse. Vigils are held in the local parks, but the candlelight illuminates faces hardened by fury. The surviving teenagers refuse to grieve quietly, commanding international media attention to demand accountability from local law enforcement and federal lawmakers. The atmosphere in the city turns electric, permanently altering Parkland's identity from a quiet suburban sanctuary to ground zero for a furious, unyielding demand for systemic change. The legal machinery grinds slowly. For 4 agonizing years, procedural battles and pandemic delays stall the final reckoning. In late 2021, the perpetrator formally pleads guilty to all 17 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. The proceedings shift entirely to a penalty phase in the summer of 2022. The sole question remaining for the jury is whether he will face execution or spend the rest of his natural life in a concrete cell. The courtroom environment is punishing. Prosecutors systematically reconstruct the massacre, confronting the 12 jurors with unedited crime scene footage and detailed autopsy reports. Grieving parents and siblings take the stand, delivering raw, devastating testimonies that outline the permanent craters left in their families. The defense counters by spotlighting the perpetrator's broken neurological foundation. Medical experts testify that his biological mother's heavy drinking during pregnancy resulted in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, causing irreversible brain damage. His legal team argues that this biological handicap, combined with a lifetime of profound isolation and administrative failures, severely impaired his capacity for basic human empathy and impulse control. Florida law mandates a unanimous vote for a death sentence. In October 2022, the jury emerges divided. 3 jurors conclude that his severe mental deficits constitute mitigating factors that outweigh the sheer brutality of the attack. That lack of absolute consensus immediately triggers the default mandate. The perpetrator is sentenced to 34 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, permanently removing the threat of lethal injection. There is no true closure in Parkland, only a heavy, enduring silence. For years, Building 12 stood exactly as it was left, a looming, bullet-pocked monument to institutional collapse. Behind chain-link fencing, the blood-stained floors and shattered glass remained frozen in time. Demolition crews eventually leveled the structure, but the psychological crater is permanent. 17 futures were erased by a threat everyone saw coming, yet no one stopped. The court delivered a final sentence, but it can never undo the agonizing reality of those 6 minutes, or the catastrophic bureaucratic blindness that allowed them to happen. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.